chance to see who all is here tonight. And we'll just give you a few minutes to print that out. The questions, just to make sure it's fully accessible for folks. How many people live in your household? Are you a homeowner or a renter? How long have you been a resident of the city of Franklin? And did you attend one of the March 22nd public open houses at Columbia State on the Envision Franklin update? Again, just to give us a chance to know who all is here. And Dan, I believe that the poll function can tell you how many folks have responded, just because I want to give us enough time to answer it, but not overstay on this. Can you see the percentage of folks, just because I'd like to know when to, okay.
Yep, we've got 84% participation, which is pretty good. So
Awesome.
I'll give a few more seconds here and then I'll end the poll.
Thank you.
All right, the first poll is closed.
Okay, thanks. Will the results display? Okay, nice. So if you just want to see quickly kind of what the representation is here, this is a quick chance to look at that, but otherwise I'm going to proceed on with our presentation today. So I just wanted to quick review for folks, what is Envision Franklin? Some folks have been to some of the previous events like the March 22nd event, but want to make sure everybody's familiar with this effort. Envision Franklin, originally from 2017, is a long-term vision adopted to shape the vision of the kind of places that Franklin's residents, businesses, and institutions want for their future. And why is this important? Because Envision Franklin provides important support in making land use decisions, managing the quality of development, determining the time and location of future growth, and directing investment and development activity. And so this is an update to that. The purpose of the update is every 5 years, the city reviews the Envision Franklin plan to make updates, evaluate what changes may be needed. This 2023 update adds a strategic focus on housing in Franklin, and that's, again, my role here today. And this update overall is an opportunity for the community to review existing goals and policies, see if new policies are needed that reflect change priorities, and to determine future land uses and design recommendations. So that's just the overall purpose. And I want to let you know that there actually is an Envision Franklin online survey that's on the city's website. It's open through April 17th. And we want as many folks as possible to respond to that. While the web addresses are here for both the survey and the Envision Franklin overall project webpage on the city's website, we will provide the citizen survey that's online at the very end of this presentation, just to encourage you to click on that and do that. So hope that if you haven't done that, you'll have a chance to do that. But forging ahead with today's presentation, again, focusing on housing, I just want to give you a sense of an overview of where we're going this evening. Starting with national trends in the housing market, just getting a sense of what trends are like nationally and how this helps us understand what impacts that has locally as well. And then we will go to look at specific housing data from the city of Franklin, current projected housing stock, what kind of demographic shifts we're seeing, again, because the Envision Franklin plan is really to look at the future and what land use and design decisions need to be made to guide the future. We'll look at housing options, what kind of housing types will meet the needs in the future for Franklin residents. And then finally, we'll have a mix throughout the presentation of polls, like the one you just took. We'll have some other polls dotted throughout the presentation. And then finally, we'll have time for Q&A at the very end. And you'll be able to put those in the Q&A button that you can see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You're welcome to add questions along the way. If you see something during the moment in the presentation, just write your question in the Q&A tab there, and we will answer them all at the end of the presentation, but you're welcome to add stuff sooner than that. So the housing market and national trends, a little look at some of that, what's it's looking like around the country. And here's our first presentation poll question. What is a trend in the US housing market? And the options here include a household with 2 parents and 2 kids is no longer the dominant household structure. Multi-generational households have become more common. The baby boomer generation expects to age in place, meaning staying in their home as they get older. Housing production has not kept up with changing demand, or finally, all of the above. So add your thoughts on that. And then when we get, let's say, between 85 and 90%, Dan can share the results so you can get a sense of what people are thinking right now. Okay, so appreciate your responses on that. Looks like majority of you did click on all the above, and I will say that that is absolutely right. All of the above are part of the trends I'm going to talk about now. So first, a few highlights. This is a publication that's produced by the Joint Center for Housing Studies out of Harvard University. They do this annually. The State of the Nation's Housing. This is from 2022. Usually they do a new one each year in June or so. So that will be coming out hopefully in a couple of months. But many of these trends are still accurate for now. And so home prices are hitting record highs. High incomes are needed to afford homes in many metro areas. Rising interest rates are cutting into affordability. So not only do you have the high prices, but you also have that rising interest rates that are making affordability more challenging. At the same time, rents are hitting record highs. Vacancies are plummeting. As you can imagine, if people are not able to buy homes, then they are probably renting. And so that makes a more competitive rental market. And then finally, cost burdens climb. Cost burden is basically how much of one's income one pays for housing. And you're considered cost burdened if you're paying more than 30% of your household income on housing and related costs like utilities. And evictions increasing, again, because if people's rents are skyrocketing, that may cause issues with their affordability. Another trend is acceleration in household growth. So again, part of the theme here is looking at supply and demand. And in addition to high prices for houses, there's more people looking for homes. So household growth for adults under 45, they are, again, millennials, maybe some Gen Z starting to get in there, looking for homes, and maybe whereas they might have been doubled up or living together, they're now starting their own households, and that's creating a higher demand for housing. Then again, you can see the housing, the year by year breakdown. So you can see it jumping up from 2019 to 2021, whereas it had been significantly lower in the 2 years before that. And what we're aiming towards here in terms of what some of the issues are, a mismatch between housing supply and demographic changes. So nuclear family household, 2 parents, 2 kids, that's actually declining as a trend. So some of the typical housing supply that's traditionally been available may have been designed for these kind of households, but that demand is dropping. And multi-generational households, again, possibly baby boomers getting older, but maybe their kids live with them, maybe their grandkids live with them, but multi-generational, all living together under one roof, as well as aging in place. Folks who've lived in their neighborhood all their lives or most of their working lives and don't want to downsize, they want to stay where they are. And so that's having an impact on the housing market as well. I'm going to talk a little bit more about housing supply more closely now, because that's a major consideration. Again, I just was talking a little bit more about demand, and now we're getting to the supply element of how much housing do we have, Is there a scarcity? But first, I just want to acknowledge what affects housing supply, because this Envision Franklin overall and the housing strategy is really directing what the plan will be like. But there's a lot of things besides the plan that can affect housing supply. So we've got the middle housing supply, and that top right, we've got local, state, and federal policy. So certainly policies can have an impact, but there's clearly many other roles that other factors have, and they're not all ones that we have control over. The cost of building materials might say, why don't we just have more single family homes and we don't need as many apartments? But the cost of building materials, that really high housing price, those can all cause challenges to boosting housing supply to where it needs to be relative to demand. Again, so we're looking at what the housing shortage is like, and looking at this nationally and what its impact may be locally. But the US across the country and markets around the country, it's an acute shortage of homes, both for rent and for sale. And over the past 10 years, the number of housing units per 1,000 people in the US has actually fallen. And as I noted earlier, the number of households in the US when under 45, that's spiked. And what that means is housing supply has gone down at the same time that demand is going up. And that's creating a really dire scarcity. And it also magnifies inequalities. People who happen to buy a home in a high demand era, people who own their own homes have seen amazing equity, right? Their house is worth much more than when they bought it, if they bought it 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And that's terrific, because that's part of what housing is in this country. Is it's a source of, it can be a nest egg, it's a way to build wealth, and that's important and great. But it also means that less affluent Americans can find themselves locked out of home ownership because high prices are too high, their incomes are not keeping up with that, and there's an inability to build up their savings because of high rents. You're like, okay, I want to rent and move out and buy a house, but the rent keeps going up, and so it makes it hard to stock away the money for that down payment and to be able to save for the house. Looking briefly at some multifamily trends, again, I've been talking about rent increases, and here's the rate of rent increases. From 2010 to 2020, rent increases went up 37%, and this is at the same period that other items for this consumer price index went up 13%. So basically tripled what the inflation is for other items. And then even just in the last 3 years, that's 26%. And that's actually a figure that's true nationally as well as in the city of Franklin. Those rent increases have been going up fairly fast. And so that 26% is true both nationally and in Franklin. And so at the same time, some people are choosing to rent more. More high-earning Americans are renting than ever. Renting has increased in popularity among older households. So it's just interesting to kind of observe where the pressures are coming from in both, again, rental and owner-occupied housing. So now we're going to get a little bit more close into the city of Franklin and current housing data to understand how the national trends that I just sketched out play out locally. But I want to just pause for a second, talk about why develop a housing strategy. Why is that added to this Envision Franklin update? And that's partly just because we want to make sure that the local housing supply and what's being built really aligns with what the housing demand is. Certainly developers, that's part of their business, but it's also partly what local housing policy makes easy to build. And if there's demand for things that are not easy to build, they may not get built. And so that's what we're going to be continuing to talk about in this presentation of what are housing options and what kind of things can be compatible with the existing neighborhoods. It's also coordinating infrastructure with housing development, making sure that there's transportation needs, roads, bridges, as well as utilities that can support housing development, because you might have the land, you might have the developer, but if you don't have the utilities, that makes it more difficult. Ensuring consistency with community character, making sure that if supply is growing, that it is compatible and appreciated by all who live here. Supporting social equity and affordability. Again, looking at what needs to happen to make housing accessible for folks who want to buy and are maybe shut out of the market, as well as having the rental stability so that their rent isn't going up 26% in a short amount of time. And then managing environmentally sensitive areas. That's certainly important. And being able to develop a strategy that can help do that very carefully and deliberately is important. So the features of a healthy housing market, it includes available, affordable, and accessible homes, senior-friendly housing stock. Again, we've got baby boomers, the biggest generation that are reaching a stage where they may have other needs. Even though aging in place is an option, there may be other options that they are seeking that aren't available on the market. Making those opportunities for first-time home buyers so that they can afford to get into home ownership. Looking at increased options for people who work in the city of Franklin, but maybe don't live here right now. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few slides. And then reduced housing cost burdens. Again, housing cost burden is how much of one's income one pays towards housing, and making sure that that's in an affordable range and not stretching too thin for folks. So quick, a snapshot of homeowners and renters, and this actually is Franklin and selected peer cities, looking at how they all compare. These cities that are in this slide are, some of them are from this peer city identification tool that's referenced on the right, and some are part of a traditional group of peer cities that Franklin often compares itself to, especially in the Southeast. But as peer cities, they have several elements in common, and it's helpful to kind of see, because even though we can talk about the national housing market, this helps to look at what some of those are like. And I just included the renter versus homeowner rates, but if you do look at the peer city identification tool, you can look at a variety of other elements that are comparative within housing specifically. So in any case, Franklin has 65.4% homeowners and 34.6% renters, and many of these peer cities are very closely within that range. Now I'm going to dive into a few slides that look at data from the City of Franklin's development report that they do annually, which is really helpful to see what the housing stock is, and just compare existing. The next slide will be housing that's been approved, and then the third will be the combination of these two that basically is what the build out is expected to be. And I just want to note that whereas that previous slide was showing the split between renters and homeowners in population, even though many of these housing types might be traditionally owner occupied or rental, these are actually about building types. They're not showing what's owner occupied or what's rental, even though you might be able to kind of estimate that. That's not really what the data is showing here. It's just showing pure what the housing stock is of different building types. And so here, the current housing stock, I'll just do the three largest ones. Single family is 55% of the total housing stock. Apartments are 24%, and townhouses and condos are about 12%. And I will also note that in my discussions with the City of Franklin staff, apartments, townhouses, and condos, it's useful to have these two, but they're somewhat fluid. So it's not always crystal clear that this is always going to be an apartment and something else is always going to be a townhouse or condo, but it's an attempt to distinguish between the two, but just understand that there's some fluidity with that definition and how it's described in the development report. In the approved housing stock, again, just looking at the three largest and of terms of what's been approved, you can see some differences that are interesting in terms of compared to what the current is. And so single family is being approved at a lower level. Apartments, so single family approved 14% of what's been approved for future housing stock. Apartments are 48%, so a much bigger share, and then townhouses and condos also a bigger share. I will say that in my research so far, there is definitely a gap between what's been approved and what's being built. And so just understand that the way development can work, especially for larger projects, it may make sense for the developer to get the entitlements up front, but again, rising interest rates, cost of materials, some shift that they may be able to adapt to while they're doing the different phases of the project. What gets approved may not be completely reflect what's being built. And so that's why it's helpful to look at this next slide of the future build out of housing stock. That's the combination again of the previous two of existing and approved. And so the top three here, single family is still dominant at 44%, but that previously the current is 55%. The apartments are at 30% compared to 24% in existing. And then townhomes and condos are at 15% compared to 12%. So that's a little bit more calibrated in terms of understanding what housing and what the distribution will be like for the foreseeable future. I'm going to go into now a little bit with demographic trends. Just again, I talked about the national. We want to drill it down to how that is reflected in the city of Franklin. And this is a chart showing residents by age group over 3 different time periods, 2010, 2021, and 2026. And so those are each the 3 different colors. And so the thing I want to draw your attention to is that the age groups are shifting upwards in terms of that projection to 2026. The top 3 in 2010 were ages 25 to 54, whereas the projection for 2026, ages 65 to 74 is nearly doubled, from 5.3% up to 10.3%, and 75 to 84 is also increasing significantly, from 3.1 to 5.5%. So just understanding that age shift, again, reflecting what maybe where housing needs are and what needs to be built to meet those needs. Also kind of tying into this are household size, and this is just for 2021, but you can see that on the right there, the light green and the blue are 1-person and 2-person households. When you combine them, that's 57%. So the majority of all households in Franklin in 2021 were 1- and 2-person households. So again, looking at, are they living in larger homes? Do we need to offer more homes that are appropriate for shrinking households and an aging population? So one more element is looking at the local housing market, talking about who can buy in, right? Who can become a homeowner in the current housing market, and looking at the difference between income, which has gone up about 9% in the last 6-year period. So that was through 2021, whereas the change in home values have gone up significantly more, 70%. So that's again reflecting on what the changes that are happening and why that makes it more challenging for people who would like to buy, not to be able to do so. The last thing I want to show you in this series is commuter trends. This is a graphic. You can see that dark green arrow on the left is showing people who live outside the city of Franklin who work there but commute in. So they work in Franklin, but they live elsewhere. And this particular data doesn't show from where they're commuting. It's just showing that they live outside the city of Franklin. And so that's 87% of the jobs in Franklin, 87% live elsewhere. And I just wanted to actually comment that I looked at similar data for 2002, and I saw that the difference between people who live in Franklin and are employed in Franklin, as compared to people who are lived in Franklin and employed in Franklin in 2020. So comparing 2002 to 2020, and that actually has dropped by about 28%. And so certainly there are people who work in Franklin and care to live elsewhere, and that's their choice. It's a matter of giving the choice to people who would like a shorter commute, who would like to live in the city, the opportunity to do so. So again, that's pointing towards some of the housing options we'll be talking about soon. Before I get to housing options and housing diversity, I just wanted to share a little bit from this 2022 Franklin Citizen Survey that was conducted last fall. And this is a little overview of the survey. The survey is designed to measure livability, and it's done by a national group, National Community Survey, that has really gotten this down to doing this in a very formal and organized way. And so they're measuring communities' livability by all of these factors. And I'm just focusing on the housing part today. At the end of this series, we'll share the link if you're curious to see the whole survey. But Generally speaking, this was mailed last fall to 2,800 randomly selected residents, and there was 2 different versions, a mailed survey and an online survey that was open. The mailed survey got 448 responses and the online survey got 217. So that's the basis for the next couple of slides that are looking at the housing specifically. So the survey results, again, I'm focusing on responses dealing with housing, but about half of respondents identified affordable housing or managing growth as the top important challenge facing the city of Franklin. 4 in 10 residents gave positive ratings to the variety of housing options, and less than 2 in 10 offered positive ratings for the availability of affordable quality housing. And again, that all fits with some of the other data we were just looking at earlier. So this is a question from the survey. And I just picked out a few, but how important is it for the city to enhance each of the following services or amenities? And the top one overall was affordable or workforce housing. 72% said a respondent said affordable or workforce housing is essential or very important. And then interestingly, tied for second place were regional transit and greenway connectivity, and that those are essential and very important. And I'm mentioning that in particular because I'm also going to bring in a little bit about the connections between housing and transportation. And I just want you to kind of remember this when we get to that point. So a couple survey questions. I picked out answers that there were plenty of them. I can only obviously fit a few answers on the slide, but this were answers that were representative of housing. And the question is, aside from transportation or traffic related issues, what's the most important challenge or problem facing Franklin today? And that included these answers, including housing affordability, a variety of housing options for residents or potential residents. Affordability, don't know what to do about this though. Franklin is exceptional, which drives up housing prices and taxes and costs in general. Creating affordable opportunities, housing and employment to all of the city's residents, not just the most affluent. And the lack of affordable housing options. Teachers and essential workers will not be able to live in Franklin. So again, these are just some representative, but there's a lot of open-ended comments that definitely are interesting to see. The one other set of responses, again, same question about issues that are the most important challenge or problem facing Franklin, but these I chose to include because they're looking again at transportation and connectivity. So lack of sidewalks, connectivity from my neighborhood to downtown via safe sidewalks or bikeways, roads and traffic, and then unchecked residential growth and impact on schools. And then I was born and raised here. I understand for economic growth, we need to grow, but I can't go anywhere in Franklin without traffic anywhere. The roads and space cannot keep up with the growth rising so quickly. So again, there's concern about managing that growth. So here's the housing and transportation that I'd like to discuss briefly, because transportation and housing are very closely tied. It's more expensive. Housing that requires cars to be able to, so if you need to be a 2 or even 3 car household, that's more expensive. And that makes the overall cost burden of both housing and transportation as well. But there's understandably valid concerns that if you're adding more housing, it's going to bring in more cars and that's going to generate more traffic. So there's questions about how do we balance that? And one element to consider is that expanding safe and convenient opportunities for non-automobile transportation improves mobility and quality of life for all. And I'm just going to share a couple of examples in the next couple of slides that hopefully will plant some seeds to think about how to magnify those opportunities. So the first example is the 20-minute suburb. And some folks may have heard of the 15-minute city. It's a concept that's become somewhat more popular, at least in planning circles lately, but it's the idea that in an urban environment that within a 15-minute radius of where you live, that you should be able to walk to your everyday needs or maybe bike, whether it's groceries or your work or school, things that you enjoy doing for recreation. Just the idea of making things close together and more compact. And so Skidmore Owings Merrill is an architecture firm that also does a lot of thought leadership, and they produced a white paper on suburban reinvention, and they're talking about the 20-minute suburb. And some of the concepts are similar to the 15-minute city, but some acknowledge the realities of suburban development as well. And so more livable, walkable, human-focused suburban neighborhoods, encouraging connected communities that reduce auto dependence, and prioritizing housing options to support these goals. And this is a graphic from their publication that gives an idea of creating hubs that can connect to a downtown. And this is an interesting example on this last slide for this section, which is the Alpha Loop in Alpharetta, Georgia. And Alpharetta, Georgia is one of the cities that Franklin often compares itself to, just to look at, how they're solving similar questions and issues. And this Alpha Loop is a connection of multi-use trails. It's been around since 2016, but they're still building it out, so it's not complete yet. But the goal is to tie together 4 of Alpharetta's main activity centers. And the idea is to better connect neighborhoods, improve travel and mobility, spur economic development, and elevate overall quality of life. So it's a nice example of how to reduce car dependence and improve quality of life and mobility in a suburban community. Okay, so we're getting to housing options and offering more choices. I'll have some more poll questions coming up, so I hope you'll be ready to answer those. So here's our first poll question. What do you think are the most important elements in a vibrant neighborhood? You got 3 choices. You can pick if something is important, neutral, or not important. And there's, I think it's 6 different choices here. So it includes distinctive character, a mix of housing types to serve different ages and households, easy access to parks and open spaces, a mix of residential and commercial uses, places that are walkable to shops and restaurants, and places that are walkable to schools. So I'll give you a few minutes. Again, when we get to 85, 90%, we will share the results. Okay, so we've got our results here. And just looking at, giving a sense of what people's top priorities are, and distinctive character is clearly important. A mix of residential and commercial uses. Oh, sorry, the important is red. I apologize. I just was looking at the left. So the top for the red, which are the most important, would be walkable to shops and restaurants, easy access to parks and open spaces, a mix of housing to serve different ages, and easy access to parks and open spaces. I may have said that one. So anyway, appreciate your participating in that. And these are elements that are included in the current Envision Franklin plan of important elements. So I'm going to talk a little bit about choices in housing options. And this slide shows single family house on the left and a mid-rise on the right, but I'm including high rise. And often when we talk about choices, often it feels like these are the two choices that we have. Either you can be a homeowner and buy a single family house, or you need to be a renter and you're going to live in a mid-rise or high-rise multifamily home. But I want to show you that there's actually more choices that can and do exist in Franklin and elsewhere. And these are just a way to kind of broaden the thought about what choices and housing options can be. So we certainly have the single family home back in there, and we have the multifamily in there, but included also townhomes, duplexes, multiplexes, which may have 3 or 4 units, accessory dwelling, which we'll talk about more in a little bit, but that can be part of a single family lot. So it's a smaller separate home, but it's part of an existing home lot. And then senior housing and assisted living, that there can be housing types that are designed to support those housing needs. Okay, so our poll questions are, do you think that Franklin needs more housing options? Again, we looked at the existing housing, we looked at the future projection. What's your take on needs for older adults and senior citizens, low and moderate income households? And then the questions that'll come up will include these two, and then one more that's going to be, what is missing middle housing? Get a sense of if people have heard that term and what they know about it. So there's 3 questions in this section, please. Okay, so our results for these 3, 86% of folks say that of this audience are that there's more housing option needed for low and moderate income households. 63% are saying that they need more housing options for older adults or senior citizens. And then missing middle housing. Missing middle housing is often used as a term for it's primarily intended to refer to architecture. So it's that third choice here. So even though housing for middle income families, we hope that offering more housing options can help address the needs of middle income families. The way it's used, again, mostly within architecture and planning circles, and the way I'm going to be using it in the next few slides is focusing on that building type. Again, we hope it will address other needs like income, but it's talking about what it looks like, where it's located. So just want to familiarize you with that as we move forward. Thank you for answering those questions. So here's the missing middle housing. This is a sketch that's produced by Opticos Design, and Dan Parolic, who's the principal there, really kind of shaped this terminology and made it more widespread. The idea is that, again, as I showed in the slide earlier, that in many cases people think, or even what's available in the community may be single family homes, that's on the far left in this picture, and mid-rise or high-rise, that's on the far right. And historically, many neighborhoods in communities throughout the US had more of a diversity, that zoning gradually narrowed those options. And so preferring single family homes, so things like duplexes or fourplexes or smaller cottages or buildings that are clustered together. Excuse me. So they may still be single family, but they are closer together so that it is easier to include more homes for the supply that's needed. Townhomes. And then again, this continuum, they've got live work and triplex and multiplex. So just showing that a diversity really exists beyond that. So this next poll question is, which housing types are compatible in your neighborhood? And they may currently exist there. They may be an opportunity to add them. So, but interested in which ones you think could be compatible in your neighborhood. And if you don't think any of them, none of the above is on there too. But just based on that glimpse that you've seen or what you may have seen just in real life of these different options, they're designed to be home scale, but what do you think about them in your neighborhood? Okay, and we've got a mix of replies. It seems like many folks are open to different options, maybe not all the same options. Some folks are not interested in any of the above, but it's interesting that it's fairly similar. The ones that seem most compatible, at least across the group that's answered, are duplexes and townhouses, seem to be the highest attraction. And so you might be interested that I'm not going to go back to the Franklin housing data now, but one of the individual types that's tracked in the City of Franklin's development report are duplexes. And those were like at 1%, 2% of existing housing stock. And I think what's been approved, or maybe what's for build out, is pretty flat. So that's just interesting to see that there's a high, at least of this group, of duplexes feeling compatible, but what's currently being built for duplexes is fairly nominal. So I'm going to dive into, this is kind of the last few slides in the presentation, but I'm going to go specifically into accessory dwellings as one of the units types that was on that list, just to talk a little bit more about what it is and where it's allowed. But what it is, just want to get a sense of what folks know about accessory dwelling or accessory dwelling units. And if you can, that's a short one, if you can just give me your feedback on how you understand those, please. There you go. Thank you. So just, are they a smaller independent residential dwelling unit located on the same lot as a single family home, a place that a family member can live on their own but be nearby, an opportunity for extra rental income for a homeowner, or all of the above? Okay, so Majority of folks got all these answers, so it's true. All of these are true. It's certainly primarily the physical structure is a smaller dwelling unit that's on the same lot as a single family home. But who lives in it or how it's used is really up to the homeowner. Occasionally, there may be limitations depending on the zoning code of how it's used. But generally speaking, both of those are usually typical options for that. And so all of the above. And we'll look a little bit next at where that's available and how it happens in Franklin. So how do accessory dwelling units get built in Franklin? A current homeowner might convert their garage or add a new structure to their property. And sometimes if a builder, a home builder, developer is building new homes, they might offer that as an option to somebody who puts a purchase offer on a home, and they can construct it on the lot at the same time as a new home. I think the first one is a little more dominant, but it's certainly important to understand that either one can be an option. And then where are accessory dwelling units permitted in Franklin? So this on the right is a legend that shows zoning districts where accessory dwelling units are allowed. And the picture on the left is an example of what a converted garage might look like, or something that has a garage and a unit above. So you may add something on that second level. And in the chat, I think we're going to have a link to the zoning map that will, if you want to look it up on your own and see, you know, it was just too big a map to include in the presentation, but if you note what the available districts are here, you can look up which one you live in and just see if that's an option where you live. Okay, so now that you know a little bit more about accessory dwelling units, just interested in what you think about them. Again, we talked earlier about a broader list of compatibility and with neighborhoods. And you may have some in your neighborhood now, but just interested in what you think about that. Thanks, Dan. So you can think, yay, they're great. Not sure, would want to learn more, not a fan, or no opinion. Okay, let's see. Oh, that's great. I appreciate that a lot of folks think it's a great idea. So 60% said that. Certainly a number of folks not sure, want to learn more. That's certainly reasonable. And if you're not a fan, that's okay too. And no opinion is perfectly fine. But I'm sure there's more that either we through the Envision Franklin or possibly through the city can help share more information with folks who would like more, either because they think it's a great idea, want to know how to do it, or want to learn more. Anyway, it's another option among, again, the variety that we've talked about that it's important to recognize and understand as a possibility. So we are now, I would like to thank you for your time at this presentation. I see several questions have come in. But we are going to have some Q&A now. We're going to talk through the questions. If you have questions either that you haven't put in yet, please put that into the Q&A now. Or if you hear something as I'm answering questions that you have more questions about, certainly feel free to chime in and we'll answer as many questions as we can. We've got a little more than 30 minutes. We've got plenty of time for questions and answers, and I look forward to talking with you about what you're asking. So do you want to, Stan's going to help me with managing the questions just because it's a little easier for him to look through and send stuff my way and try and maybe do it in a certain organized order. So what do you think would be first, Dan?
Yeah, well, thank you again, Deborah. And I wanted to point out to everyone that there is a link in the chat that takes you to a survey response that the city is hosted. So please make sure you go to that link and fill out the survey. It would be very helpful as we look to get all the input that we need to assist the city with updating Envision Franklin. Deborah, I'll start with some of the questions that had shared some similar traits, and you started to talk a little bit about traffic and housing. So maybe, I guess, talk a little bit about that relationship, and also about how can density be provided in a way that traffic can be, accommodated, because as you kind of talked about, there's some existing issues going on with traffic now.
Right. No, that's always an important question. And I'll identify a couple things in terms of clarifying the relationship between housing and transportation. When I talk about suburbs and car dependency, the idea is not that people are going to get rid of their cars. They're not. Okay. They are important and they're needed, and people need them for transportation. The goal is to reduce use so that you have other choices that are safe and accessible, so that if you have grocery shopping or a school or your job that's within a certain radius that feels safe and accessible to you, you have a choice. That it's not that I'd love to walk to work, but I can't because the sidewalk isn't continuous. It feels uncomfortable. It doesn't feel safe. And so looking at ways to really maximize the opportunities to make a choice that's not a car. It's not saying you can't have your car. It's saying the more that we can give people choices, the more it can help reduce the traffic that's out there, because certainly that's something that I've heard many times in our time in Franklin, that people feel concerned that, traffic is an issue, and that's understandable. And so looking at ways to diversify that. In terms of the question about density, I'll say that this is something that's not going to happen immediately, but in areas that you feel that you can accommodate more homes and more people, that's what's going to create the opportunity to add closer shops, grocery, housing, because retail needs customers to support it. They're not going to, there's kind of an expression in real estate called rooftops to retail. And that means you need the residential density before they're going to start building the retail commercial that is nearby. And so again, that's not going to all happen at once, but to the extent that you can identify, if you can picture that 20-minute suburb where there were hubs of different neighborhoods that also had connections, in this case to a downtown, but those hubs might mean that you have a certain critical mass of commercial retail near you, so that you can go and get a cup of coffee with a friend and not have to get in your car. You can go get some milk and maybe a few groceries. It might not be the full supermarket, but it might be the equivalent of a corner grocery store, retrofitted for suburban style, but that's accessible and able to get to. So again, just keep in mind that I think one of the earlier questions is, when we're talking about what are the elements of a vibrant neighborhood, having convenience to be able to get to nearby of those mixed use neighborhoods where you can do some shopping nearby. And then if we combine it with more safe and accessible options that are not requiring you to get in the car, you need to have the density of housing to be able to support that kind of retail.
Thank you, Deborah. The next question, I think that we've gotten several questions that kind of fall into the same category. Talk a little bit about how the city could or could not, or how other cities, for that matter, have helped provide options for affordable housing, and what is affordable housing, especially in Franklin. So maybe you can speak to kind of affordable housing a little bit.
Absolutely. No, those are great questions. It definitely that what is affordability is important, and I'll address that first. It's a little confusing and requires a little to distinguish. There's affordable housing, and the way that's often used in this country is it often refers to subsidized housing. And that's important. Subsidy is a way to help people fill the gap between their incomes and what the housing cost is. And that's typically a public subsidy. And then there's different ways that that can be provided. And that's kind of the capital A, capital H affordable housing. And that's certainly an important consideration. It's not been a primary focus of where we've been going with the Envision Franklin plan so far, but it certainly is something that's important to acknowledge and to, as part of the housing strategy that I'll be helping to develop, it's something that we want to note and address, but it may not be a full-blown part of that, but it's important. The other side of housing affordability is basically more tying, I talked about cost burden earlier. And so it's basically what's the proportion of your housing cost to your overall income. And I mentioned that often that's cited as 30% of your income should be dedicated towards housing, again, and utilities, or if you're a homeowner, towards insurance and taxes, et cetera. There's kind of a bundle of things that are considered housing costs. And so that's something that we're looking more closely at, of what the what's available on the market, what the ratio is with incomes, but just making sure that there's options for a range of incomes that are, again, affordable to them. And that's a gap that's getting increasingly harder to close, just because the cost of construction is high, the cost of labor is high, and the cost of land. So those are all things that make it challenging. Options for that a city could do to create more, I'll call it housing affordability, because when we get into the subsidized version, again, it's important. And I want to acknowledge it as part of the range of housing options, but it's got so many layers of finance that are needed to build it. It's just another conversation. So I'm just trying to acknowledge that. So what I'm focusing on now is more towards households that are not eligible for subsidies, but still find themselves priced out of the housing market. And how can a city help support a range of affordability? And so some of that can be making it easier to build smaller homes or homes that are higher density. Again, that was my goal in bringing out the range of housing options, because a single family home is the most expensive housing type that exists. And it's important and valuable, and lots of people enjoy it and want to live there, but it needs other options for homes to be for homeowners, or for households who want to become homeowners, or just to be able to afford to live in the community. And so it doesn't have to be only owner occupied, but again, duplexes, again, just going back to the difference between 47% of folks felt that a duplex would be compatible in their neighborhood, but the current rate of production in Franklin is close to zero. And so recognizing that, making policy and prioritizing in housing policy ways to maybe streamline the approvals process for duplexes. So there's two ways to make housing more affordable. You can lower the cost of production, or you can raise incomes. And the city is not really in a position to raise incomes, even though, and we even saw, again, previous slide, the huge difference between housing values and how much housing equity has gone up, and how much incomes have gone up. And there's that big gap. So looking at ways to lower the cost of production, some cities may dedicate publicly owned land for the production of affordable housing, so it takes down that land cost. Sometimes they may offer incentives for, if you build extra units that are affordable to a certain income target, you can build more units, especially if it's a multifamily property. You might say, okay, you can have an extra floor of units, again, creating more density that can also then support some of the nearby retail that folks want. Sometimes there's a housing trust fund that cities may establish, or to be able to say, okay, and there's different ways to accumulate the money. It can be from a transfer tax, it can be from a payment from a developer from another project. There's different ways to get money towards the Housing Trust Fund, but the Housing Trust Fund is then administered by the public element, whether it's the city or maybe a commission that administers it. And then they can use that as essentially a subsidy to make it accessible for people who would not otherwise qualify for that. Other options might include a community land trust, which is a way that you can, again, it's a way to lower the cost of land. So a community land trust is an entity. Some of them are nonprofit, some of them are initiated through public sector. So this is kind of overlapping a little bit. It's not all just the city doing it, but it's a way to lower the cost of housing and make it more accessible for folks that may be priced out. So the way a community land trust works is that the land trust, again, often a nonprofit, owns the land, and the homeowner can buy what's called the improvement, basically the house. And so because the land cost is separated in this case from the housing cost, there's often then also conditions also. One, the initial home buyer may buy it at a below market price. They can still have some wealth building in there and have some accumulation, but they also, when they resell it, it's usually at a limited appreciation. So they get some of the equity returns, but not maybe what the full market would drive, because that's the way it's going to be affordable for the next household. So those are some examples of different ways, both through strategy, policy, programs, that communities can support more affordability.
That's great, Deborah. I think maybe a follow-up to that about housing is, how can, aside from affordable housing, how can other housing types, you mentioned the missing middle, how can those be, implemented, or how can those, are there incentives for other housing types? And specifically, we've got several ADU questions. Is there, because sometimes you kind of see the Airbnb issue potentially with ADUs. What have you seen implemented, or how have other cities used policy to help with managing ADUs? So a few other housing questions for you there.
Okay, so I'll just try and make sure I got the different ADU stuff in there. And was there something in addition to ADUs? I just was trying to take notes as you were talking.
ADU is, one housing type, but other ways to, with the missing middle, that other housing types could be constructed, from potentially as small as an ADU, but up to some of the more multi-unit architectural buildings that you were showing.
Right. Well, some of it is allowing it to be built. Of course, it has to be available land if it's new construction in terms of other building types. But streamlining the ability to build, so it, because when you're developing, time is money. And so if it takes a long time to build, let's say,